Hello, class. In this set of recording, we will look at James chapter 4, verse 13 through chapter 5, verse 6. And we titled this lecture, Warning in Light of Judgment. Warning to Jewish believers, making plans without God. James 14, James writes, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Come now emphasizes a sense of urgency and occurs in the New Testament only here and in chapter 5, verse 1. James indicates a habitual action on the part of believing Jewish merchants as they plan. Today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Their intentions are fully developed down to the very last minute detail. They speak words reflecting assurance and self-confidence. These assumptions picture the future as entirely under their very own control, which makes them guilty of the sin of presumption. The sin is making plans without God. Let's read verse 14. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. So now we'll look at two reasons that James provides that these actions are considered a sin. He says you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. The point is one cannot be sure what tomorrow will bring. And back in the Old Testament, Proverbs 27:1 states, "Boast not of yourself of tomorrow, for you know what a day may bring forth." These believers were not living by faith, which gives calm against tomorrow's insecurities, because we don't know what a day will bring forth. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. James's point here is that life is, James' point here is that life is transitory and can very quickly end. These businessmen have no way of knowing if they will be alive tomorrow. The word that's translated vapor, the Greek word atmos, refers to a breath appearing in the cold air for a split second, but then it just disappears. So how foolish is it to ignore God when life is nothing more than a vapor? We should be sensitive to the will of the Lord. James 14, instead, he says, you ought to say, James 4:15, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. In contrast to what they said in James 4, verses 13 and 14, the previous verses, these businessmen should be saying, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. They need to seek the will of the Lord and to be sensitive to change their plans if God so wills. This admonition is especially true in light of the future judgment that would come in their day, AD 70. That's when Titus and the Roman general came and surrounded the city of Jerusalem and did so for quite a long time. More than a year, and eventually the city was destroyed and the temple was destroyed. So this admonition is especially true in light that James was predicting. He didn't predict that judgment, but he was saying you will be judged. You need to seek God's face, and there's no guarantee about the future. When internally, inside the land, the Jewish economy would collapse in 70 AD. While externally outside the land, the Jewish itinerants will be economically affected. Rather, they should declare If the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that, because both their lives and their deeds are dependent upon God's will. Their lives and activities must be committed to God's grace. It is not wrong to make future plans, but in making them, the believer must be sensitive to the will of the Lord and be willing to change if God so wills. Look at verse 16. James writes, "But as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil," says James. "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." Failure to follow the Lord's direction results in committing the sin of self-glory. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, he says. The expression, "but as it is," refers to this past sin in contrast to more appropriate future speech. You boast, he says, demonstrates presumptuous boasting. And in your arrogance, he says, refers to pretentious bragging. This boasting is evil. Such boasting displays their arrogance. Finally, James states that these believers already know this truth. Therefore, their speech is sinful. The therefore in verse 17 emphasizes the reason why the boasting in verse 16 is wrong, and that they know to do good and do not do it. This means these Jewish believers are not doers of the word. That's what he had said earlier in previous chapters. Don't be hearers, but be doers of the word. Don't be hearers only, but doers of the word. As Jewish believers, they should be aware of decisions formulated in conscious dependence on God's will. Here we see verse 1 in chapter 5. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries, which are coming upon you," says James, as he predicts the future. These rich men outside the church in this verse are the prosperous Pharisees and Sadducees who oppressed the Jewish believers that James was writing to. To them, to the prosperous Pharisees and Sadducees who were unbelievers, he admonishes, "Weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you," he says. The word weep, translated weep, is the Greek word klio, and it means to sob bitterly. The same word is used of wailing for the dead. So you can get how bitterly the sobbing would be when their miseries are coming, when they lose their riches. The word translated howl, alaluzo, is an expression of intense grief, and it is a howl of agony. They are to weep and howl for your miseries. The Greek word teleporia, are coming upon you. This refers to the resultant feelings of wretchedness and distress. It will personally fall upon them. And so, look at verse number 2. We see an approaching destruction of riches that belongs to the Jewish unbelievers that he was addressing in verse 1. Your riches have rotted. Your garments have become moth-eaten, he says. Your gold and your silver have rusted. Their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire, says James. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. The phrase, your riches have rotted, the word translated rotted means wasted away as a reference to the accumulated foodstuffs. The phrase, your garments have become moth-eaten, the word translated garments, the Greek word hemation, refers to the long outer robes embroidered as a sign of wealth. This expensive clothing will become moth-eaten and valueless. The phrase, your gold and your silver have rusted. Gold and silver do not rust, as we all know. But James, of course, knew this as well. This was his way of saying gold and silver will become worthless in the day of judgment. We see that in verse number 3. The rust accumulated through non-use will function against them as an adversarial witness, exhibiting their failure to use monetary gain for the benefit of others. This is a visible sign of non-use. Gold and silver were not used to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, or to aid a neighbor. Instead, they were hoarded. No love of neighbor was demonstrated. Their rust will consume your flesh like fire, he says. What's James's point? It's this. The rust will consume the hoarders and fuel the fire of judgment, for you have stored up your treasure for the last days, when it will be lost, he says. And so in verse 4, we look at the conduct of the rich and their guilt. James writes, behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your fields, and which has been withheld by you, cries out against you. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabaoth. They are guilty, these rich scribes and Pharisees, unbelievers. They are guilty of injustice as seen in the defrauding of their laborers. This is a reference to the day laborer, whose daily pay was being withheld on some technicality. Yet this worker's meals were dependent upon this daily pay. Withholding these daily wages was specifically forbidden by the law of Moses, and as stated in Leviticus 19:13 and in Deuteronomy 24 verses 14 through 15, and by the Old Testament prophets Jeremiah 22:13 and Malachi 3:5. James specifically charges the rich with this crime. As a result, the pay itself cries out against you. The Greek present tense of this verb indicates that it is a continual crying out, as I've tried to explain in the Greek. The verbs that have present tense is not so much about the time, but the aspect is of the action of the verb is a continuing aspect. So we say here, that's what we're seeing. Not only does the money cry out to be delivered to the rightful owners, the victims also cry out to the Lord of the Sabaoth. The usage of Lord of Sabaoth reveals a Jewish author, which James is, addressing Jewish readers, which he is. A summary of the sins here, demanding judgment. And this will be our last slide. We have one more with my reference to the source I use, which is your textbook. But let's look at verse 5 and 6. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a wanton pleasure, a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. And so let's look at this in piecemeal. First, he says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth. Now, he's still talking about the rich and the scribes and Pharisees, these unbelieving Jews who oppress the Jewish believers in Christ. He says, you have lived luxuriously on the earth. They have lived a daily life of luxury and self-indulgence. Living this life, they are concerned with the present, the now, and not the future, not the hereafter. He says, also, you have led a life of wanton pleasure. This adds the concept of wastefulness to their self-indulgence. He says, you have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Hearts, the word translated hearts, refers to their inner desires, not the physical heart, but what comes from within us, what we desire. Their inner desires of these rich, unbelieving Jews have become fattened for the day of slaughter, says James. The day of slaughter will be, we know, because we're looking back, we know what history happened in 70 AD. They didn't when James wrote this. AD 70. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man, he says. Put to death points to judicial murder. The righteous man in this context most likely refers to Jewish believers. And remember, that's who he's writing this letter to. And so they are being persecuted by the Jewish non-believers who are rich. But these oppressed Jewish believers that James is writing to did not resist the persecution. For these sins, the rich are going to be under a particularly heavy judgment. And that certainly, we know from history, occurred in AD 70 when Titus, the Roman general, came in with his armies and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And we see, I got this from your textbook, the Dr. Fruchtenbaum's commentary, Ariel's Bible commentary, the Messianic Jewish epistles.